Imagine yourself in a medieval castle surrounded by imposing walls, knights in shining armor, and servants busy with their daily tasks. Now think about the kitchen, a place where the heat of the flames dances on the stone walls, where the smell of fresh bread and roasted meat fills the air. But wait, how did they keep all that food fresh without refrigerators, without freezers, without vacuum sealing? That's right, life in medieval castle kitchens was far more complex than we might imagine in a time when modern technology was non-existent. Food preservation was a matter of survival. Just think a castle could house hundreds of people, from nobles to servants, and all of them depended on a supply chain that needed to be efficient and durable. And in times of war or sieges, the situation became even more critical. But medieval people were masters of adaptation. They developed incredible techniques to keep food fresh, many of which we still use today, albeit in more modern forms, from underground cellars to the clever use of herbs and spices. Human creativity knew no bounds. And the most fascinating part, many of these practices were so effective that some foods could last for months or even years without spoiling. So if you've ever wondered how medieval castles kept their pantries stocked without the help of modern technology, you're about to find out. Get ready for a journey through time where we'll explore the secrets of castle kitchens and the ingenious techniques that kept food fresh and safe to eat. And the first secret we'll uncover the cellars and cold chambers of castles. How were these structures hidden deep within the fortresses able to maintain low temperatures and keep food fresh for weeks? Let's find out. If you've ever visited a medieval castle or seen one in movies, you might have noticed that many of them have something in common. Deep cellars and dark chambers hidden in the bowels of the fortresses. These spaces weren't just storage for barrels of wine or beer, they were the heart of the castle's food preservation system. But how exactly did these cellars and cold chambers work, and why were they so effective? The answer lies in the ingenuity of medieval architecture. Cellars were built below ground level where the temperature was naturally lower and more stable. The thick stone walls of the castles helped insulate against external heat, keeping the interior cool, even during the hottest summer months. In some cases, cellars were built near water sources or underground streams, which helped further reduce the temperature. It was like a natural refrigerator of the Middle Ages. But it wasn't just the location that made the difference. Ventilation was also crucial. Small, strategically placed openings allowed air to circulate, preventing the environment from becoming too humid, a factor that could accelerate food spoilage. Additionally, the wooden barrels and ceramic containers used to store food were designed to control moisture and odors. And what was stored in these cold chambers? Practically everything cured. Meats, cheeses, fruits, vegetables, and even grains were kept there in some castles. There were even shelving systems and compartments to organize food according to its durability. Imagine opening one of these cellars and finding rows of wine barrels, stacks of cheeses wrapped in cloth, and meats hanging from the ceiling, all preserved to last for months. But here's a fascinating tidbit. Not all castles had deep cellars in hotter regions or fortresses built on rocky terrain. Medieval people had to improvise. They created cold chambers above ground using double walls with a layer of sand or earth between them to insulate against heat. These creative solutions show how necessity was the mother of invention in the Middle Ages. Now imagine the challenge of keeping these systems running during a siege when the castle was isolated and supplies needed to last as long as possible. How did they do it well? That brings us to the next topic: salting, drying, and smoking. The most common methods. These techniques were essential, not only for daily life but also for surviving times of war. If you've ever eaten a piece of salted cod or enjoyed a cured ham, you're experiencing a culinary tradition that dates back to the Middle Ages. Salting, drying, and smoking were the pillars of food preservation in medieval castles, and these techniques were so effective that many of them are still used today. But how exactly did they work, and why were they so important? Let's start with salting. Perhaps the oldest and most reliable method of preservation. Salt was a precious resource in the Middle Ages, often called white gold. It not only enhanced the flavor of food, but was also essential for preventing bacterial growth. Meats, fish, and even some vegetables were completely covered in layers of coarse salt and left to rest for weeks or even months. The salt drew out moisture from the food, creating an environment hostile to microorganisms. Salted cod, for example, was a common item in castle pantries, especially in coastal regions. Drying was another widely used technique, particularly for fruits, herbs, and meats. The idea was simple: remove moisture from the food to prevent bacterial growth in hot, dry climates. Food was left out in the sun to dry naturally in more humid regions. Low-temperature ovens or well-ventilated areas within the castles were used. Apples, pears, raisins, and even meats like medieval jerky were products of this technique. Imagine castle kitchens filled with fruits hanging from strings, slowly drying to be used during the winter. Finally, there was smoking, a method that not only preserved food, but also added a unique flavor. Meats and fish were hung over wood fires, where the smoke slowly penetrated the food's fibers. The smoke acted as a natural preservative and created a protective layer on the food's surface. Smoked hams, sausages, and even cheeses were common in castle pantries. Smoking was especially useful in colder regions where the smoke helped keep insects away. But here's an interesting detail. Not all foods could be preserved with these techniques. What happened to more perishable products like milk or fresh vegetables? Well, that brings us to the next topic, the art of fermentation: bread, beer, and cheese. How did medieval people turn perishable ingredients into products that could last for months? While salting, drying, and smoking were ideal for meats and fish, medieval people faced a different challenge when it came to foods like milk, grains, and fruits. These products were highly perishable, but castle inhabitants found a brilliant solution: fermentation. This technique not only extended the shelf life of food, but also transformed simple ingredients into delicious and nutritious products. And as a bonus, it even yielded some beverages that livened up medieval banquets. Let's start with bread, the staple of the medieval diet. The process of fermenting bread was almost magical. By mixing flour, water, and a natural starter often made from a saved piece of fermented dough, bakers created a dough that rose and gained texture. Fermented bread was not only more flavorful and easier to digest, but also lasted longer than unleavened bread. In castles, ovens were bustling places where different types of bread, from simple loaves for servants to refined ones for nobles, were produced daily. Now imagine the smell of fresh beer being brewed in the castle kitchens. Beer was another marvel of medieval fermentation. Made from grains like barley and wheat, beer was a safe drink to consume, as the fermentation process eliminated harmful bacteria from the water. Plus, it was highly nutritious and an important source of calories, especially for workers and soldiers. Medieval beer was denser and less carbonated than modern versions, but it was so valued that it was often used as part of wage payments. And of course, we can't forget about cheese. Fermenting milk was a clever way to preserve this highly perishable food by adding rennet, a natural enzyme, to milk. Medieval cheesemakers created an impressive variety of cheeses, from fresh and creamy ones to aged and intensely flavored ones. Cheeses like Gouda and cheddar have their roots in this era, and many castles had their own secret recipes passed down through generations. But fermentation wasn't the only technique that relied on special ingredients to work. Speaking of ingredients, have you ever wondered how herbs and spices were used? Not just for flavor, but also for preserving food. That's a story worth telling next. If you've ever wondered why a medieval cuisine was so generous with herbs and spices, the answer goes beyond taste. In a time when food preservation was a matter of survival, these aromatic plants were true allies. They not only masked the taste of food that was beginning to spoil, but also had antimicrobial properties that helped extend the shelf life of products. And of course, they added a touch of sophistication to the dishes served at grand castle banquets. Let's start with herbs, which were grown in castle gardens or harvested from nearby fields. Sage, thyme, rosemary, and basil weren't just seasonings. They were used to protect meats and cheeses from spoilage. For example, bay leaves were placed in grain barrels to keep insects away, while rosemary sprigs were used to wrap cured meats, creating a natural barrier against bacteria. Additionally, many herbs were turned into infusions or oils, which could be used to preserve food or even as home remedies. As for spices like cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and pepper, they were true treasures in the Middle Ages. Imported from distant places like India and the Middle East, they were expensive and highly prized. Beyond adding exotic flavors to dishes, spices were used to preserve both sweet and savory foods. Cinnamon, for example, was added to fruit preserves to prevent mold growth, while cloves were used in meat pickling to extend its shelf life. And of course, we can't forget saffron, which not only gave dishes a golden hue but also had antibacterial properties. But here's an intriguing detail: the use of herbs and spices wasn't limited to the kitchen. In times of war or plagues, they were burned to purify the air or used in medicinal potions. This versatility shows how medieval people had a deep understanding of the properties of plants, something that is often underestimated today. Speaking of knowledge, have you ever thought about how all this expertise translated into the daily life of castle kitchens? How did cooks and servants organize their work to ensure everything ran smoothly, from preparation to food preservation? That's a story that takes us directly to the next topic. The routine in castle kitchens, organization, and efficiency. Imagine the hustle and bustle of a medieval kitchen, the sound of knives chopping, the heat of flames dancing under iron pots, the smell of fresh bread coming out of the oven. Now multiply that by 10, because castle kitchens weren't just places to prepare meals, they were complex operation. Centers where every detail was planned to ensure hundreds of people were fed daily, and of course all of this without the help of modern appliances or digital schedules. Organization was the key to success. Castle kitchens were divided into specific areas, each dedicated to a task, one section for baking bread, another for preparing meats, and yet another for cooking soups and stews. The cook's LED by an experienced chef worked as a team following a strict routine that began before dawn and only ended after the last dish was served at the evening banquet. Servants had well-defined roles. While some tended to the fire, others chopped vegetables, prepared spices, or monitored stored food. Communication was essential, and shouts of "watch out for the hot pot" or "more firewood for the oven" echoed off the stone walls. And of course, there was always someone in charge of ensuring that preservation techniques, like salting, drying, or smoking, were applied correctly so nothing went to waste. But the real challenge came during feasts or important ceremonies, when the demand for food increased exponentially. On such occasions, the kitchen's efficiency was pushed to the limit. Imagine preparing a banquet for hundreds of guests with elaborate dishes that included roasted meats, fresh bread, cheeses, beers, and desserts, all while ensuring the food remained fresh and safe to eat. And speaking of challenges, few situations tested a medieval kitchen's capabilities like a siege. When the castle gates were closed and enemies gathered outside, food preservation became a matter of life and death. How did castle inhabitants prepare for these critical moments? That's a story that takes us straight to the heart of medieval survival strategies. Imagine the scene: the castle is surrounded by enemy troops. The gates are closed, and the food supply from outside has been completely cut off inside the walls. The tension is palpable. The question hanging in the air is simple but terrifying: how long will the supplies last? In situations like these, food preservation wasn't just a matter of convenience, it was a matter of survival, and medieval people had brilliant strategies to face these challenges. One of the first measures was strict rationing. The castle lords and their advisors carefully calculated how much each person could consume per day, ensuring supplies lasted as long as possible. Meats, grains, and other essential foods were distributed in controlled portions, and waste was strictly forbidden. In some cases, even nobles had to give up luxurious banquets and settle for simple meals. But rationing was just the beginning. Castle inhabitants also turned to even more intensive preservation techniques. Meats that would normally be consumed fresh were salted or smoked in large quantities, while fruits and vegetables were sun-dried or turned into preserves. In some castles, there were even emergency systems like underground silos filled with grain that could be accessed in critical situations. Another smart strategy was the use of long-lasting foods. Bread made from barley or rye flour, for example, lasted longer than wheat bread. Aged cheeses, salted meats, and dried fish were prioritized, while perishable foods like fresh milk or eggs were consumed quickly or turned into more durable products like cheese or preserves. And of course, we can't forget about creativity in times of crisis. When supplies began to run low, medieval cooks had to improvise. Wild herbs, roots, and even tree bark were used to supplement meals. In some cases, animals like rats or pigeons were hunted inside the castle itself to provide additional protein. It was a matter of making do with what was available. But even with all these strategies, life during a siege was incredibly difficult. Hunger and malnutrition were enemies as dangerous as the soldiers outside the walls. And in the end, a castle's ability to withstand a siege often depended not only on the strength of its defenders but also on the efficiency of its kitchens and pantries. This ability to adapt in times of crisis leads us to a fascinating aspect of medieval life: the myths and curiosities surrounding their food preservation practices. After all, what's true and what's exaggeration? When we talk about how medieval people kept their food fresh, that's a story worth exploring next. The Middle Ages is a period surrounded by myths and legends, and when it comes to food preservation, it's no different. Many of the stories we hear about how medieval people kept their food fresh are a mix of real facts and fantastical exaggerations. So let's separate fact from fiction and discover some curiosities that will surprise you. One of the most common myths is that medieval people used spices to mask the taste of spoiled meat. While it's true that spices were used to preserve and flavor food, the idea that rotten meat was served at banquets is an exaggeration in reality. Medieval people were quite aware of the risks of eating spoiled food and had effective techniques. To prevent it from happening, poorly preserved meats were discarded or used as animal bait, not served at the table. Another curiosity involves bread. It's said that medieval bread was as hard as stone and almost inedible, while some breads were indeed dense, especially those made to last for long periods. Most of the bread consumed in castles was fresh and flavorful. High-quality bread made with refined flour was reserved for nobles, while servants ate simpler versions made with less processed flour. And contrary to popular belief, bread wasn't used as a plate to serve food. That's an idea that emerged much later. Now here's a surprising fact. Medieval people were masters of recycling. Nothing was wasted in castle kitchens. Leftover stale bread was turned into crumbs to thicken soups or used as animal feed bones. And animal carcasses were boiled to make nutritious broths. Even the ashes from the fire had a use. They were used to make soap or to clean pots and utensils. And speaking of utensils, you know that medieval people already used rudimentary packaging techniques. Meats and cheeses were wrapped in cloth, soaked in vinegar, or aromatic herbs to keep them fresh. Longer fruits and vegetables were stored in wooden boxes lined with straw, which helped absorb moisture and prevent rotting. But perhaps the greatest curiosity is the role of women in food preservation. While men were often responsible for hunting and slaughtering, women played a crucial role in processing and storing food. They were the guardians of family recipes, knew the secrets of herbs and spices, and were experts in techniques like fermentation and preservation. In many castles, it was the lady of the castle who oversaw the pantries and ensured supplies were always in order. These stories and curiosities show us that medieval life was far more complex and interesting than we often imagine. And by looking to the past, we can find valuable lessons on how to deal with today's challenges. After all, the need to preserve food and avoid waste is just as relevant now as it was in the Middle Ages. When we look at medieval castle kitchens, it's impossible not to be impressed by the creativity, knowledge, and resilience of the people of that time. In a world without refrigerators, freezers, or vacuum sealing, they developed techniques that not only ensured their survival, but also created a rich culinary culture. And the most fascinating part, many of these practices are still present in our lives today, albeit in more modern forms. Think about the cheese you buy at the supermarket. Fermentation, a medieval technique, is still the basis for artisanal cheese production worldwide. Or the cured ham you savor at a special dinner. It's the result of centuries of perfecting salting and smoking techniques. Even the jars of preserved fruits and vegetables we find on supermarket shelves have their roots in medieval drying and storage practices. But the lessons go beyond cooking. The Middle Ages teaches us about the importance of sustainability and maximizing resources in a world where food waste is a global problem. Medieval practices of recycling and reuse can inspire us to rethink our habits. After all, why throw away something that can still be useful? And of course, there's the lesson of adaptation. Medieval people faced immense challenges, from prolonged sieges to climate changes, and found ways to adapt and survive at a time when the modern world faces its own crisis. This ability to innovate and persevere is more relevant than ever. So the next time you open your fridge or savor a preserved food, remember the medieval castles and the people who, with ingenuity and determination, ensured that food made it to the table even in the toughest times. And who knows, maybe you'll be inspired to try some of these ancient techniques in your own kitchen. After all, as the saying goes, the past is the key to the future.